All right, I'm hoping that everyone can see my screen at this point. Sorry, my screen was having a little bit of a challenge. If it's not coming up, hopefully someone can pop in the chat and let me know, or speak up and let me know. It's great to be here. I apologize that I can't be there in person. I was really looking forward to joining everyone in Berlin, but with the pandemic, I just wasn't able to do the travel with my university regulations. So I am really happy to present on this topic on the importance of diversity in psychedelic science. This is a topic that is really important not only to myself, but to a lot of the people on my broader team and network of researchers and students and community folks who I'm connected with in this space. And I'm really here just as kind of someone who's affiliated with all of these other people. And so even though I'm the one talking today, I really just want to honor the fact that I'm representing a much broader network of people that have helped to connect me into spaces that not too long ago I didn't really have any connection to myself. So I just want to highlight that it's really a group of us here presenting. I'm going to start off by bringing these words into the space: diversity, power, privilege, calling, duty, responsibility, service, and ethics. These words are words that I think get thrown around, especially in the last year or two, get thrown around quite a bit in psychedelic spaces. I've heard many teams, many groups talking about the importance of diversifying psychedelic research and talking about a responsibility or ethics. But very little has actually taken place in terms of actionable steps towards making this a reality. And so I'm going to start here by bringing these words into this discussion. But what I'm going to do today is actually go through a series of questions that helped me in my own process and my own academic work to orient how I was going to take these words and actually do something differently, make them real in the research that I do in psychedelics, make them real in the clinical work that I do as a therapist, and also bridge them from academic spaces into my personal life and vice versa. So this slide really is just to set the foundation of something that is probably already very clear to everyone in this audience, which is that the last few years, you've had to be living under a rock to not have noticed that psychedelics are hitting the mainstream. We have a lot of money being put into psychedelic research. We have a lot of money being put into for-profit psychedelic enterprises. We have a lot of new folks getting involved in psychedelic research and psychedelic clinical spaces. And in this growing enterprise of psychedelic science, we see, unfortunately, some of the same problems that already exist in the academic structures that have preceded it, which is a lack of diversity, a lack of representation of people who are not a part of the privileged majority in a variety of societies around the world. Highlighting this, we also see headlines like this. We see that there are calls, not only in public media spaces, from people who are talking about this challenging issue, but also there are some of us who are publishing in the scientific literature on the topic of the lack of diversity in psychedelics. Not only the lack of diversity among participants who are participating in psychedelic research, but also the lack of representation on the teams of researchers who are conducting that type of research, as well as the type of students involved in that work, all the way down through the broader public engagement of communities that are connected to this work. But who am I? How did I get here? How am I connected to this? So I want to call out my own identity, my own place in this space. So I'm a psychologist, I'm an academic researcher. I'm white and I'm male. I'm physically able. I have food and housing secure. And because of all of these identities, I have quite a bit of power and privilege in my own experience in psychedelic research. Not only do I have all of these identities, but I also have been fortunate to have had positions as a postdoc fellow at Johns Hopkins, and now as faculty at Ohio State, and continuing on the team at Johns Hopkins, where I continue to retain a lot of power and privilege in that identity. And as part of that context of that identity, I am also a queer male, and I'm gay. And so because of that sexual and gender minority, I also have had connection and understanding to what it's like to have a foot in both types of spaces, to both have an outward appearance that affords me power and privilege in society, and also to have this internal identity that is still stigmatized. And this connection, this understanding has, I think, deepened my value and my intention of continuing to pursue this topic and to pursue these conversations in order to broaden the teams that I work on, to broaden the spaces that I'm in, and to continue the dialogue that I see is so critical in order to break down the systemic issues in the academic spaces that we're all a part of, in order to hopefully, as we forge a path forward in psychedelic science, to break down some of the things that are keeping people who would otherwise have trajectories in this work from obtaining seats at the table. But what is power and privilege in psychedelic spaces? You know, I have, and you have, we all have in this room, a certain amount of power and privilege. We have this power and privilege simply by the fact that we are all here in this moment right now, connected in this presentation at this conference, in hopefully what is a beautiful space there in Berlin. Even myself here in my office, joining from Ohio State University, the fact that we can connect via this technology, and that we can join together and have the types of conversations that I hope the community there is engaged in this weekend. We have access. We have already been included. So by the fact that we have this access and inclusion, we are the people in psychedelic science who have at least some degree of power and privilege. Now, we all probably have different levels of this power and privilege. But in psychedelic research, it's imperative that we recognize that we already are in this space of power and privilege. And so how do we first do something about recognizing how to understand where the pathways are broken down from people who maybe don't have access to these types of spaces, or don't have access to a trajectory that could enable them to get into a path where they could get into these types of spaces, where they could be working in a psychedelic research center or gaining psychedelic research mentorship, is first to understand that someone who doesn't have access is unlikely going to be the person who holds the responsibility for forging the path to break down those barriers. And unfortunately, for far too many of us, probably in this room, myself included to some degree, we didn't have mentorship early on in this process. Some of you probably started off, like myself, being somewhat isolated, maybe really interested in this topic, but uncertain about how you are going to find a path to do this type of research, or to maybe learn more about this topic in a clinical setting. And hopefully you have stumbled into networks or connections, communities, maybe even mentors that have been able to facilitate a path for you. But for each one of us who has stumbled into that type of mentoring and connection, there are going to be thousands of people who don't yet have the power or the privilege to access that type of trajectory. So we have the opportunity, because of that power and privilege right now, to do something about it, to reach out, to connect, to make those types of opportunities available for others. Another question to ask ourselves is, why are we doing psychedelic research? What is the point of any of this? Is it for power? Is it for attention? Is it for recognition? Or is it for service? Is it for others? There is a lot of attention coming towards this space right now. There's a lot of reason to get interested in wanting to have a career in a field that is going to garner a lot of attention, a lot of potential opportunity going forward. And there is, I think, a responsibility that each of us are going to have in understanding how and in what ways is our own egos tied up in that process. How are we going to address the ways in which we might be tied into that outcome of that power, of gaining power, of enjoying that attention, or enjoying or wanting recognition? And if we are connected to a value of service, if we are engaged in this research because we see that there's an important piece of it that's tied to serving the populations that this research is hopefully serving, then how are we demonstrating that in the teams that we're on, in the way that we design the research studies that we design? How are we using that value of service or working for others inside the psychedelic spaces that we're in order to make sure that we are connecting into those values throughout the entire process? Who is our research benefiting? And why do we care specifically about that group? You know, there's a lot of people who are conducting research on really important topics in psychedelic science, topics that range from clinical indications that can be life-changing, you know, treatment-resistant depression being one of them, PTSD. I mean, these things are affecting millions of people. People are also starting to branch into special populations. The teams that I'm connected to are starting to look at groups of people who are non-English speaking, specifically Spanish speaking individuals, Black, Indigenous, and people of color who've experienced racial trauma, veterans who've experienced combat related distress. And most recently, we're embarking on a project of gender and sexual minority individuals. And as part of each of these projects, we are exploring the question of, is this project mostly benefiting us as the researcher, or is this project mostly benefiting the people that we are trying to serve in this work? Is this topic, is this research going to ultimately serve the people that it's for, or are we extracting something needlessly from the people that it's supposedly going to serve in order to gain more of that power in this space? And I think that this is a critical feature of what needs to be addressed in your own intention in order to be systematically aware of the ways in which you're either coming back to that list of questions at the beginning, whether you're holding up the structure that is kind of keeping people away from accessing these types of spaces and getting into this type of work, or whether you're opening up and breaking down those walls of helping people gain access. What are our duties to the populations our research examines? So how can our studies impact the population more directly? How can you include them along the way? One of the ways that we do this in the studies that I've just mentioned are we try to invite not only diverse representation in the types of questions that we're asking and the types of populations that we want to focus our research on, but we try to include this at every stage of the process. So including people who can be a part of the question making, the study design process, including members of the community in a feedback process to have input and real power on the team in order to have access to how the study is designed, what questions are asked, and in what way that information might be disseminated. Moving through that process of including them in the dissemination process so that they not only have been a part of the whole formulation of the project, but then they are then adequately credited with that contribution so that it's not simply a scientific contribution from someone at an academic institution who has, very little connection to the community that they're talking about, but where the community and the scientist can actually have a robust dynamic connection that broadens the scope of the work that's being done and can connect it back to the community more specifically. And in what ways are we complicit, specifically complicit, in upholding the structures that systematically exclude people that are different than us from doing the work that we get to do? And this is really important because what I mean by complicit is, are we silent on this matter of exclusion? Do we defend the lack of diversity in our teams? And I don't mean do we defend it by saying we don't want to have a more diverse team. I mean, do we defend it by saying things like, well, if people just, if we had more applicants who were people of color, or if we, we're just trying to select the right kinds of people and we can't help who applies, to me, that's a defense. And I don't know that that is necessarily going to help propel us into a place where we are actually tackling this issue head on. Do we make excuses for the lack of diversity and inclusion? Do we just not have the time or to deal with this issue? To me, these are all ways in which we are complicit with this issue. These are ways in which we can rest in our spaces of power and privilege instead of actually doing something to tackle this issue. Are we functioning as a conduit or as a terminal of power and resources? This is something that's really critical because this question was something that I personally wrestled with prior to launching Source Research Foundation. I started Source Research Foundation after my own experience as a graduate student, having really being very isolated and having no connection to mentoring in psychedelic research or connection to psychedelic community. And when I was fortunate enough to get a fellowship at Johns Hopkins, where I then was kind of in a buffet of lots of psychedelic opportunity and mentorship, I decided that I wanted to not just take all of that power and resource and just take it all in for myself, but I wanted to try to find some way to act as a conduit of that resource and move that along to others. And so by starting a nonprofit foundation that helps to fund scientific studies among students, that's one way that I found that I could act as a conduit for things like resources. But there are other ways to do this as well. You can be a conduit by building interdisciplinary and diverse teams. It takes very little effort to invite people to collaborate, to connect. You can be a conduit for other types of resources, for students, for opportunities, for trainees, for staff. Maybe for other faculty at your institution who don't have access to the work you're doing, but who are interested in it. You can also connect with other teams of people at other institutions. For every project that I'm working on right now, I think almost every single one of them is comprised of interinstitutional teams of people, because I find that the more diversity we have on the team, from discipline diversity all the way through race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, age, background, geography, all of these factors strengthen the type of work that we can do, because it enhances our ability to to dig into the topics that we're interested in. It also adds complexity to the work. Certainly, it adds, maybe more doodle polls and scheduling issues than sometimes I would like. But the importance is that it also, I think, contributes to a more meaningful product in the end. You can also say yes more to offers from other people to connect, or say yes more to offers from other people for them to be able to connect.
Dr. Davis, I'm sorry to interrupt. I'll just give you a 5-minute warning. Thank you.
Thank you. Every stage of the process benefits from this. From the research question formulation, study design, recruitment, data analysis, interpretation, writing, dissemination, everything benefits from this process. What else can you do? You can donate money, you can donate time to researchers or organizations that are addressing these systematic issues in psychedelic science and spaces. There are a number of them. I would find those researchers and organizations that you connect with, that you see talking about these issues, and help them out. Even a little bit goes a long way. Most of the nonprofit organizations that I know of who are working on addressing these issues, or who have special funds to try to address these issues, are working with very little money. They're not like the big for-profit corporations who don't have or who have access to investors. These types of organizations are really kind of doing a lot with a little, and they could do a lot with a little from you. Lastly, I just want to highlight the broader team of folks that I'm connected to, that I mentioned at the very beginning of this talk, that is really in one way or another connected with me here today. These are all folks who are on a variety of projects that I'm working on right now, and again, kind of represent my thinking on this topic, and how I hope that I can kind of be an example and a conduit and an open kind of forum for how we can kind of evolve as instead of a siloed psychedelic science research enterprise, into a more open and diverse and welcoming research space. So thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, Dr. Davis, for a really thought-provoking and timely talk, I think. We've now got time for a short Q&A, so we'll take some questions that have been submitted in the chat. To start off with, what role do you think neurodiversity plays in the psychedelic community?
Oh gosh, that's a great question. I think it's a really important piece of this question that that I unfortunately didn't touch on in my talk, but all forms of diversity should be a part of this question, including neurodiversity, and thinking about the ways that not only the ways that people might learn differently or communicate differently, but also thinking about the ways that people might be able to contribute differently in the ways that they think things differently, or the ways that they might be able to connect with the team differently. I think that certainly should be a part of this conversation as well.
Great, thank you. Do you feel that social work as a profession and in their function has to be greater represented in the psychedelic field?
Yes, I do. I think that what we need to do is we need to start thinking more about interdisciplinary work in psychedelic science and in the psychedelic field more broadly. So social work needs to be more represented, but I think we just need to start thinking about what is the future of psychedelic work going to look like. Not only in psychedelic research, but in psychedelic clinics. Social workers, psychologists, psychiatrists, nurses, counselors, these teams of people will likely be involved in the day-to-day operations of a clinic or other types of centers. And so they should be involved in the research. They should be involved in the development of these treatments. It's one of the reasons why I came to a College of Social Work and why I collaborate with psychiatry and psychology, because I believe very strongly in this interdisciplinary approach to psychedelic science.
Great, thank you. I think we have time for This question, it's quite a long one, so maybe choose which sub-aspect of it you like. Doesn't the title of the presentation already assume power? Is research only conducted by academic researchers? What about the researched? What are the power reactions? And how do we include people as co-researchers, include them in publications? Feel free to address which points you'd like.
That's a great point. So part of that is kind of what I highlighted, but maybe didn't say outright, which is that, we need to be thinking about how those of us who are maybe in the power position, who are in academic places, which are automatically conferred this privilege of having the ability to conduct research, we're in the system that is kind of allowed to do this. How do we engage people who are not in these types of spaces to have them involved in the research, to acknowledge that there are other ways of learning and knowing, and how do we talk about that and highlight these other ways of learning and knowing in order to find ways to promote that type of work, either in collaboration or in the ways that we talk about our own work. What types of work are we citing, for example? Who are we adding to our references section when we publish something in the scientific literature? Who are we talking about in presentations? But also, how are we inviting people to collaborate on our work and including them as authors on our studies? I think it's really important to consider both of those.
Great, thank you. I think we also have time for a question from the on-site audience. Yeah.
Okay. That's a kind of psychedelics. From the audience, please, Professor Davis, wait with your answer until I have turned the audio on again. Is there a question from the audience? Please just raise your hand and a colleague will come with a microphone. Okay, here in front, please.
Thank you. Unfortunately, I came a little late, so I don't know if you addressed this point, but I would be interested in the voice of, for example, indigenous people who use these psychedelic substances for a long time, or just the cultural dimension of these substances and how the communities that use these substances are heard, and what's your experience with this perspective? Is it heard in psychedelic research, or what's the role of it? That would be interesting to me.
Yes, that's a great question. I think that unfortunately, for most academic researchers, that is very much a separate issue, and it hasn't been included, certainly not in the day-to-day working of academic research. I think that it's been given some attention in terms of discussion, and at the same time, I want to acknowledge that there are researchers across, especially maybe outside of psychiatry and psychology, specifically researchers in anthropology and a variety of other disciplines, history, and other spaces, who are certainly actively engaged in this critical piece of psychedelic science. And it's important to recognize that those disciplines are also scientific disciplines. I think, unfortunately, the term science often gets applied to what's considered hard sciences, and the distinction between hard and soft sciences is frankly an arbitrary one in my opinion, but this hierarchy exists in the academy nonetheless. So I think we have to hopefully kind of bridge these dialogues between indigenous communities, where these some of these psychedelics have come from. Certainly not all of them have come from indigenous lineages, and that's part of the conversation that also needs to have more thoughtful dialogue. But we also need to start connecting the disciplines within science where there are already these dialogues occurring, where there are already a lot of knowledge that's been formulated and gained, and community connections built in order for psychology, psychiatry, and social work, and those of us on more of the clinical sciences and to gain from the relationships, from our own new relationships that we can form with these disciplines in order to rectify some of this growing divide.
So thank you very much once again, Professor Davis. Sorry, we won't have time for a last question. No, unfortunately not. But I'm convinced that Professor Davis will be happy to answer your question if you send him an email. We just have to keep the schedule tight. And so an applause once again. Thank you very much, Professor Davis, for your talk. And best wishes from Berlin.
Thank you for joining us for the Speaker's Corner. Hopefully a few more people will come in now we've started the session. For submitting your questions, if you could use the Q&A tab, that would be great. And if you'd like, I can invite you up to the stage so you can ask your question yourself, or if not, I can ask it for you. And you can also upvote your favorite questions. So whilst we wait for questions to come in, I'll kick things off. I met someone yesterday who's a cardiologist, and he was explaining how cardiac patients are often excluded from the trials, but they also often have comorbidities, anxiety, depression. Is that these kind of specific health subgroups? Are you aware of any efforts trying to incorporate that diversity into the research?
That's a great question. I think that physical diversity is going to be really important for obviously the dissemination of clinical therapies. I know of some people who are trying to build studies specifically for more, I would say, health compromised populations. So there's some folks at the University of Michigan who want to work with people with fibromyalgia, which just are much more complex in terms of their chronic pain management, and they have a variety of other ailments, including some psychiatric co-occurring problems that would probably typically be excluded from some of the other trials that have been underway in psychedelic research, and some projects going on at University of Florida and elsewhere that are also kind of, I think, starting to get into more complex health areas. I think as that occurs, they hopefully will start opening up into some of these other areas. Regarding cardiac issues, I haven't heard of anything specifically looking at that. I know that there is a growing interest in starting to open up dialogue and potentially a study in looking at the question of psychosis and whether or not people who are being excluded for even a remote risk of things like bipolar disorder or other psychotic disorders, whether or not they should actually be excluded, and even some intriguing questions around whether people who even not are at risk but actually have the disorder, whether they should actually even still be excluded, kind of akin to the framework of we're having people with cancer diagnoses coming in not to treat the cancer but to treat the systemic issues and the sequelae of mental health problems that come along with the cancer. Well, people with psychotic disorders have a whole lot of other mental health things that come along with that because of the stigmatization and because of the social rejection and the isolation that come along with having that condition. And shouldn't they have access to the unitary and the connection and the mystical and the insight that might come along with a psychedelic experience if it can be done safely and not exacerbate their psychotic symptoms? So I think in all of these ways, hopefully we'll be able to ask some of these questions scientifically. I think it's going to be the case that this can be done once we can get through the first hurdle of FDA and EMA approvals, because at that point, I'm hoping that we'll see some of the regulations soften, which will then hopefully make it a little bit easier to conduct the research, which then it'll be a little bit easier to ask some of these questions because the restrictions can be eased a little bit.
Yeah, great, thank you. I think it's really important that people like you are raising these questions whilst we necessarily have to keep things more narrow for initial approval, like you said. It's great that you're raising these conversations. Thank you.
Thank you.
We have a question from the audience. Do you think the psychedelic community is more open to embracing diversity, since psychedelics are known to promote openness?
That's a great question. I do think that there is, I think as a general rule, I would say yes to answer that question. But I think what's fascinating, at least in my own neck of the woods of the psychedelic forest, one of the things that I've seen, which is perhaps a little unique to the psychedelic community, is that there's also this opposite, sometimes, opportunity, I'll call it, for things like ego inflation and other issues related to things that could happen when people who maybe come into psychedelic community or psychedelic spaces with pre-existing personality features that are predisposed to things like grandiosity or other types of let's just call them like narcissistic tendencies that may actually have the opposite effect, where they can become more exclusionary and even harmful or dangerous. And unfortunately, some of those people end up garnering quite a bit of power and privilege in the process. And so I think that as a whole, the community, I think, is more open, and it's one of the reasons why I think the conversations are taking place, and there is more pressure to have these kinds of conversations. But I think we have to put more pressure on the people who are in positions of power to not just talk about it, but to do something about it.
Great, thank you. I think Idris would like to ask a question, so I'm going to hand over the mic. Is that come up for you, Idris?
I think, hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. That's great.
Oh, perfect. Thank you, Doctor. Thank you, Annie. So basically, I wanna, that's like a personal question. Like, I want to ask for advice about how to basically join the conversation, especially if you don't have like a professional training. I'm in the midst of like changing careers, and I'm very passionate about psychedelics, but it's very difficult to penetrate, like to go back to school or like to apply for masters if you don't come from a medical background. So I would really appreciate it if you have some insight about this. Thank you.
I think my biggest advice is to consider consider the range of areas that you might want to contribute to. So there's a lot of attention being put into clinical psychedelic work, and certainly that is something that is, I think, helping to propel this field and this movement forward into the broader culture around the world. However, there are a lot of academic disciplines where this topic is being studied. There are, if you go to Source Research Foundation, where we are providing grants to students from around the world to study psychedelics, most of our students are not from medical backgrounds. They are in anthropology, or they're in history, or they're in other types of disciplines. And we also provide funding to students who are in psychology and psychiatry. But the reason that we're trying to broaden the scope of who we're funding is because those other disciplines are doing this work as well. They're just doing it in a different way. They're asking different kinds of questions. They're digging in deeply into these topics, using the skills that they have from their backgrounds, from the best ways that they're exploring these topics. And that's a critical thing that actually not only enhances the medical sciences, but will help to, once we have regulatory approvals, those disciplines will be critically needed to actually disseminate these treatments back into culture, right? And to find a home for them in communities where we'll need to develop a language, we'll need to develop a vocabulary among families and young people who will grow up hopefully in cultures where these medicines will be available to them. We'll need to have disciplines that have an understanding of the history of psychedelics, not just the way that the media portrays it, but the actual history of psychedelics. So I would encourage you, I guess my long story short answer is, I would encourage you to consider non-medical degrees. What are you most interested in? What do you have access to that might not be a medical training, but that might be really interesting and thought-provoking to you, that might be a path forward. There are other thoughts, though. One of the things that we're trying to do at SRF going forward is to try to create a virtual collaboratory. I don't know if it's going to launch before the end of this year, but hopefully in 2022, we're hoping to launch a Discord or some other type of forum, either on our website or in some kind of, like, again, Discord service or something that can connect people, not just students, but really anyone who wants to try to contribute in order to try to connect and network people better. It's been a goal of ours for a while, but we just haven't been able to find the bandwidth to facilitate exactly how it'll work. But you can follow us on our newsletter there, and obviously we'll talk about it when and if it's available. But those are just some of my ideas.
Right. Thank you very much. Well, for now, I'm involved with advocacy, but yeah, I see a lot of places where research can be directed, but of course, not having credentials makes it very difficult. And I think it's also a little bit frustrating, but I get what you're saying. Thank you very much.
I should also mention, as and I know we maybe want to make time for another question, but I'll just end that question by saying yes, in order to kind of have jobs, like as a researcher, you typically have to have that background. However, there are sometimes opportunities as a research assistant, which usually involves kind of minimal background, having some kind of basic university background. And I know that those opportunities might be somewhat minimal currently, but I think they are growing, and I'm hoping in the coming years there'll be more of those opportunities available to people. I think the challenge that we have right now is that even though there's been money starting to flow into these academic spaces, I think so many of the resources have still been going into the networks of people that have been connected to those places. And so hopefully as those networks fill up with resources, that can start to open up to the broader system. And we'll see things like more job announcements and actual recruiting and things like that. So if you're interested in wanting to be a research assistant, or kind of coming into it to work without having that kind of training to be a faculty member, then I would connect with those sites that are doing this type of research, because most of them probably have an email list or a newsletter where they will post announcements for jobs that you might be qualified for.
Super. Thank you very much. Really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thank you. It's a really useful question and answer for me as well, and I'm sure for many people in the audience. So thank you for that. I think we'll have to stop there, but thank you, Dr. Davis, for your time and your really interesting answers, and thank you everyone for joining. And I hope we all enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.